It's no secret that many private pilots are uncomfortable with crosswinds. Often what seems like an issue with physical coordination comes from an incorrect or incomplete understanding of the concepts. This missing conceptual understanding can also undermine the decision-making aspects. Which runway should I use? Or what's the crosswind component right now, and is it too much? Maybe the procedural side is unclear. What amount of flaps is appropriate, and what speed? Let's cover each of those areas, starting with crosswind technique. It's usually easy enough to recognize when you're left or right of the center line, but it can be tougher to tell if the nose is pointed exactly straight. That's probably because, at least in side-by-side airplanes, we're not seated on the longitudinal axis of the airplane. If you look directly over the nose of the airplane from the left seat, over the spinner, you're looking a little to the right, and that can cause a tendency to point the airplane a little bit to the left of the intended spot. The key to visualizing the longitudinal axis of the airplane is to learn it in a situation where you know you're pointed and moving in the same direction. Let's get in the airplane on the taxiway and have a look. So taxiing is really the time to figure out what it looks like to be pointed straight in your airplane, because it's the only way to taxi is to point where you're going. You can see here that if I were to look over the center of the cowling and line up straight that way on a landing, I'd be using a point that's to the right of center, so I'd be lining up left a little bit. And what I can see here, though, is that there is sort of a line that I can form from what is, I guess, a screw on top of the glare shield there to a point that's just to the right of a vent. And if I can just visualize where that is and visualize a line formed by those 2 points, that looks like a good reference for me for the longitudinal axis of the airplane. Of course, that's specific to this plane in this simulator, and so you have to find something that works for you in your airplane. But without some clear reference like that, it's very easy to be lined up a few degrees left or right, touch down a little bit sideways, without realizing it right up until you actually touch down and feel the side load. I think the problem begins with thinking in terms of 3 separate, discrete landing techniques. One for left crosswinds, one for right crosswinds, and one for no crosswind. If you ask someone to describe their crosswind technique, it'll often sound like this. I have a left crosswind, so I'll be using a slip to the left aileron to bank into the wind, and right rudder to hold the center line. I'll touch down in a little bit of a bank to the left on the left main first, and ease in full aileron to the left into the wind. That describes the result, not the technique. The proper technique can be used on any landing, crosswind or not, and good crosswind landings will follow. On every landing, use whatever rudder it takes to align the longitudinal axis of the airplane with the runway centerline. Point the nose with your toes. Use the ailerons to control your lateral position over the runway. Right of the centerline, increase bank to the left to move left. The controls, of course, are interrelated. As you increase bank to the left, the nose will want to yaw left, so increase right rudder pressure to keep pointing straight down the runway. As you decelerate in the flare and the control surfaces become less effective, the inputs required will become greater. But the bottom line is, use whatever rudder it takes to point straight, and whatever bank is required to control lateral position. Where this technique really shines is when winds are light or variable. In those cases, pilots often make no attempt at crosswind inputs because the landing just doesn't register as a crosswind landing. It's not obviously a left or right crosswind landing, so it must be a normal landing. But the side loads caused by ignoring even light crosswinds aren't good for tires or landing gear, and especially if you fly tailwheel aircraft, can easily escalate into serious directional control problems. The best way to practice crosswind correction technique is to separate it from the actual landing. Dragging the runway involves a low pass down the entire length of the runway in crosswind conditions. This is a great exercise to practice to make the relationships between aileron and rudder inputs become intuitive and instinctual. That's important because in the real world, crosswinds are rarely perfectly steady. You need to make quick reactions to changing conditions, and that requires well-developed instincts and muscle memory. It's also a great thing to practice in the simulator. Traditionally, simulators have been used for instrument flying and procedural tasks, but they can have great value in the stick and rudder realm too. The controls aren't going to feel exactly the same, but that's okay. The aerodynamics are correct in the sim, and an exercise like this is about developing an intuitive understanding of the concepts involved. You can get lots of reps in the sim and really solidify the relationships between aileron and rudder, drift and alignment. Okay, we're lined up on runway 25 right at LAX for the dragging the runway exercise. And you probably wouldn't be able to do this at LAX in real life, but you want to find the longest runway that you can, because it'll give you the longest time to practice it. And we've got wind out of the north here at about 10 knots, so you can see the crab that I have in here to hold the center line. Now on this first pass here, all we're going to do is slip to hold the runway center line. So, left rudder to point the nose straight down the runway here, whatever it takes. And of course, if that's all we do, we're going to slide to the left here, so a bank to the right to stay over the runway center line. And all I'm doing is thinking about here, rudder as controlling where I'm pointing. So point the nose with your toes, and using the ailerons to control left and right drift. I'm going to maintain about this height over the runway, and I'm doing about 65 knots here. The simulator gets a little harder to control in crosswinds at lower speeds. And we just take this all the way down the runway. Alright, we're set up again, and this time we're going to actually maneuver the airplane left and right laterally across the runway while keeping the longitudinal axis pointed parallel to the runway. So pointing straight down the runway, but maneuvering laterally left and right. So let's start out by transitioning out of this crab here. Rudder to point straight. A little bit of aileron to bank right, as much as is necessary to stay over the center line. And now let's move the airplane left all the way over to the left edge of the runway. So I'm going to take out some of the bank. I'll have to take out a little bit of the rudder too, but just whatever it takes to point straight while we move left here. In the real plane, you don't want to go all the way to the edge just in case you accidentally touch down, but in the sim we can. And as I get to the left edge, I increase the bank again to stop moving, along with a little left rudder to keep us pointed straight. Now to maneuver back to the center line, a little bit more bank to the right. We kind of lose some rudder effectiveness here in the sim, so I'm actually at full rudder here, not quite able to keep it pointed straight. And as we were moving back to the right there, the added drag from the larger slip meant I needed to add a little bit of power too, just to maintain airspeed and height. So we can do as many passes as we want like that, separate from the actual landing technique, and really get a feel for how the crosswind correction works, separate from having to worry about also judging the flare and landing the airplane. The primary authority on speeds and flap settings to use for crosswind landings comes, of course, from the POH. Some POH guidance is black and white. For example, the Cirrus POH says, normal crosswind landings are made with full flaps. But others are less definitive and leave some up to pilot judgment. The 172S POH says, when landing in a strong crosswind, use the minimum flap setting required for the field length. So what's a strong crosswind? The maximum demonstrated component, 15 in this Model 172, would surely count. What about 10 knots, or 5? That's up to the pilot to decide, and it may come down to practice and experience. It's always a compromise because there are also very good reasons to use as much flap as practical. Let's make a pros and cons list. On the pro side, flaps help reduce touchdown speed. Most landing accidents happen on rollout, often because of extra energy at touchdown. The difference in many light GA aircraft isn't much, though. In the 172S, for example, the difference in calibrated stall speed with flaps up versus flaps down is just 5 knots. Extra drag reduces the ground roll. The early part of the ground roll, where the plane still might not have the weight fully on the wheels, but also doesn't have as much aerodynamic authority as airborne, is critical. Extra drag from the flaps helps to slow down to the point where there's more weight on the wheels. Of course, if you really want a dump lift, you could retract the flaps on touchdown. That's a legitimate bush flying short field technique, but it's generally not recommended for normal operations. That's because of the distraction that retracting the flaps adds at a critical time, and also the potential for accidentally grabbing the wrong handle and retracting the gear. Flaps sometimes increase yaw stability. The extra drag on each side dampens yaw motion, and that can be useful when the wind is gusty. On the con side, that extra surface area from extended flaps gives wind gusts something to push on. In gusty winds, that might feel like less stability. Note that effect specifically applies to gusts. An airborne airplane doesn't feel a steady crosswind more with flaps extended. In fact, it doesn't feel a steady crosswind at all, but it does feel sudden changes in wind. In other words, gusts. Flaps reduce touchdown speed. Yeah, it gets a spot on this side too. Having a little extra airflow over the controls at touchdown means they're a little more effective. As I said before though, it might not be by much. Gusty crosswind landings are more likely to end in go-arounds. When that happens, the transition is smoother and simpler with flaps already in a safe climb position. Most traffic pattern stalls happen on takeoffs and go-arounds, and attempting to climb at the normal pitch attitude while forgetting to retract flaps can be a recipe for a go-around stall. With points on both sides, it's best to try crosswind landings in multiple configurations and see what works best in your airplane. Consider taking a CFI with you, and of course defer to any POH guidance on the topic. What speed to use? Again, check with the POH for an appropriate speed to use in crosswind conditions. Pilots often fly faster approaches in crosswind conditions. They reason that the extra speed improves control authority used for countering the crosswind. That's true, but at some point you need to slow down to land. If the crosswind requires a high-speed touchdown just to maintain control, it's probably best to go somewhere else. Often the extra speed carried on final just extends the flare and increases the time spent decelerating through a region of lesser control effectiveness. In the worst case, the pilot reacts to the extra floating by forcing the plane onto the runway before it's ready to land. Don't add speed just for a crosswind. What about the common advice to add half of the gust factor on a windy day? That is valid advice. Gusts can result in sudden changes in indicated airspeed, so by increasing approach speed, a greater buffer is created. But don't overdo it. You still need to bleed off that extra speed to land. When making runway decisions in real time, it's useful to have a quick rule of thumb for estimating the crosswind component. The rule is this: if the wind direction is 30 degrees off the runway direction, the crosswind component is half the total wind speed. If it's 60 degrees off the runway direction, consider the crosswind component to be equal to the total wind speed. You can visualize this on a clock face. 30 minutes is halfway around the clock, and 30 degrees means half the total wind is crosswind. 45 minutes is 3/4 of an hour. A 45-degree crosswind results in a crosswind component that's 3/4 of the total wind. Remember that METAR and ATIS information can be an hour old. Get up-to-the-minute weather from ASOS or AWOS when it's available, or ask the tower for a wind check. And of course, the best real-time wind information comes from the environment. Windsocks, steam, and water patterns are always up to date. Suppose you have two runways to choose from. The longer, wider runway of the two has a nearly direct crosswind. The other runway aligns with the wind, but is much shorter and narrower. Which one should you choose? Start with an understanding of what the crosswind component is and how that fits into your personal limits and your aircraft's capabilities. If it's pushing either envelope at all, it's probably best to take the headwind. You'll touch down slower, and that alone will mitigate some of the concern the shorter runway brings. Performance considerations are also a factor. Even with perfect technique, a shorter runway carries more risk. An abort for an engine failure after takeoff, or any abnormality on the roll, might result in an overrun. Tailwinds should be avoided. They're more harmful than headwinds are beneficial. And a direct crosswind can easily shift a little to become a tailwind. For that reason, a quartering headwind at one airport might be a better choice than a direct crosswind at another, even if the quartering headwind is stronger and has a greater crosswind component. Both options still tied? Consider what other traffic is using. Other pilots' decisions shouldn't dictate your own, but going against the established traffic flow does add some risk. The big runway might be better equipped and better lit. At night, if one runway has a PAPI, that can make all the difference. Finally, consider convenience. Maybe one runway is close to your FBO or nicely aligned with your arrival direction, and maybe that breaks the tie. Still stuck? Okay, flip a coin. Obviously, physical stick and rudder skills are important, but there's much more to crosswind proficiency than just that. Understand the concepts behind the techniques and the procedural and decision-making aspects. And, of course, practice.